Inside the Kremlin, one single signature could change everything. Russia's front line is bleeding manpower, its economy straining under labor shortages, and volunteer numbers quietly running dry. A digital system already tracks every draft-age man. Regional bonuses are spiking without explanation. One battlefield decision could trigger the next call-up. What truly happens the moment Putin signs? A leader who needs more soldiers, but is terrified of asking for them. That's the trap Vladimir Putin is stuck in right now. The war in Ukraine keeps eating up manpower every single week, and Russia's current system of paying volunteers to sign up isn't keeping pace. So why doesn't Putin just order another mobilization and solve the problem overnight? Because it's not that simple. Calling up more men by force could easily backfire, sparking panic, protests, and public anger. So Putin is stuck weighing two dangers against each other: not having enough troops on the battlefield or losing control of the mood back home. So which risk would you take if you were in his position? For now, most experts agree another full mobilization is treated as a last resort, not a first option. But last resort doesn't mean impossible. Stick around, because the next section shows exactly what happened the last time Putin tried this, and why it still haunts the Kremlin today. Historical precedent: the 2022 partial mobilization shock. Rewind to September 2022. Russian forces were losing ground fast in places like Kharkiv and Kherson, and Putin made a move he'd avoided for months. He signed an order calling up around 300,000 reservists. It was supposed to look organized and controlled. It didn't turn out that way. Almost overnight, panic spread across the country. Long lines formed at border crossings. Hundreds of thousands of military-age men grabbed whatever they could carry and fled to nearby countries like Kazakhstan, Georgia, Armenia, and Turkey, just to avoid being drafted. That moment mattered for one big reason. It broke an unspoken deal between Putin and everyday Russians. As long as the war stayed far away from their daily lives, people stayed quiet. The mobilization shattered that quiet. And that single event still shapes how carefully the Kremlin handles this topic today. So could Putin really risk triggering that same panic twice? Let's look at the battlefield math next. Current manpower economics and attrition rates. Here's a number that might surprise you. Every single week, Russia is estimated to lose or use up somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 soldiers on the front line, through injuries, deaths, and exhaustion. And to keep the war machine running, they need to replace almost that same number, week after week, just to stay even. Right now, most of those replacements come from volunteers, not forced conscripts. But volunteers aren't unlimited. When casualties spike during a major offensive, or when Ukraine launches a surprise counterattack, the gap between what's needed and what's coming in can widen fast. Think of it like a bucket with a slow leak. As long as new water keeps pouring in, the bucket stays full. But the moment the leak gets bigger than the pour, everything changes. That's the tightrope Russian military planners are walking every week. So what happens when volunteers simply aren't enough anymore? That's where money enters the picture. Crypto mobilization and financial incentive limits. Instead of signing another mobilization order, Russia has been using a quieter strategy that some analysts call crypto mobilization. In plain terms, that means paying people huge amounts of cash to volunteer instead of forcing them. In some wealthier regions, sign-on bonuses have climbed past $20,000 to $30,000, more money than many workers there could otherwise earn in years. On top of that, recruiters have leaned on prisoners, foreign workers, and people struggling with debt, offering them a way out through military service. But here's the catch: this strategy isn't free, and it isn't endless. As inflation rises and the pool of willing recruits shrinks, regional governments are having to pay more and more just to get the same number of soldiers. It's like a store constantly raising prices because fewer people want to buy. At some point, the money stops working. And when it does, what's the next move? That's where politics gets dangerous. Domestic political risks and regime stability. If there's one thing that worries Putin more than losing ground in Ukraine, it's losing control at home. Mass mobilization doesn't just take men away from their families, It creates fear, anger, and grief that spreads through entire communities, especially among mothers and wives watching their sons and husbands get called up. Russia already had a taste of instability in 2023 when the Wagner mercenary group briefly turned against Moscow. That event rattled the Kremlin and reminded Putin's inner circle just how fragile public loyalty can be when pushed too far. State television can shape the story on screen, but it can't stop a neighbor from noticing an empty house or a mother from crying at a funeral. That's the kind of truth propaganda struggles to cover up. So could another forced draft be the spark that shakes Putin's grip on power? It's a question the Kremlin clearly doesn't want to test, but they've been preparing for it anyway, quietly.
Infrastructure readiness and digital conscription systems. While Putin avoids another public mobilization announcement, something has been happening behind the scenes. Russia has been quietly building the tools to make future call-ups faster and much harder to escape. New laws created a digital military registry linked directly to Russia's government services system. That means draft notices can now be sent electronically, instantly, without needing to hand-deliver a paper summons. Anyone who ignores that notice can face immediate travel bans and frozen bank accounts. In other words, Russia has built a system that could allow it to quietly call up small groups of men, region by region, without ever making a dramatic national announcement like it did in 2022. Government offices have also been hiring more staff, specifically trained in military registration and enforcement. This isn't proof mobilization is coming, but it does show one thing clearly. The Kremlin is preparing the machinery just in case. And that machinery isn't free either. It comes with a real economic cost, which we'll break down next.
Labor shortages and macroeconomic trade-offs. Here's something people often forget. Soldiers don't just disappear from the battlefield equation. They also disappear from factories, farms, and construction sites, and Russia is already feeling that gap. Unemployment inside Russia is sitting at historically low levels, which sounds good on paper, but really means there simply aren't enough workers left to fill open jobs. Defense factories, construction crews, and farms are all competing hard for the same shrinking pool of workers. Now imagine pulling another 300,000 to 500,000 working-age men out of that already stretched economy. Prices would likely climb even faster, supply chains would tighten further, and everyday goods could become harder to find or afford for regular Russian families. So mobilization isn't only a battlefield decision, it's an economic gamble too. Every soldier sent to the front is a worker missing from the civilian economy. Could rising prices at home end up shaping this war just as much as the fighting itself? Let's look at what could actually push Putin to pull the trigger anyway.
Military strategic triggers, frontline escalation and operations.
So what would it actually take for Putin to sign another mobilization order? It likely wouldn't happen just because casualties are high. That's already the normal, grinding reality of this war. It would take something bigger, something that breaks the current balance completely. One trigger could be a major Ukrainian breakthrough, where Russian defensive lines collapse faster than reinforcements can arrive. Another possibility is Russia itself choosing to go on the offensive in a much bigger way, launching a large, multi-front push to seize new territory across Donbass or beyond. A third scenario involves Moscow trying to build an entirely new strategic reserve force from scratch, ready for a longer war. In each case, the common thread is the same. Current troop numbers wouldn't be enough anymore. Until one of those situations happens, most analysts believe formal mobilization stays parked on the shelf. But if it does happen, the reaction wouldn't stay inside Russia's borders. Let's look at how the rest of the world would respond.
International reaction and Western sanctions pressure. If Putin ever does sign a new mobilization decree, it wouldn't just be a domestic story. It would send shockwaves through Western capitals almost immediately. A formal call-up would signal one clear message. Russia is preparing for a war that could drag on for years, not months. That message would likely speed up NATO defense spending, unlock new rounds of military aid for Ukraine, and push countries to tighten economic sanctions even further. Allies who may have been hesitant before could suddenly feel pressure to act faster.
It could also complicate Russia's relationships with countries that have stayed neutral, especially across parts of the global south, who might start questioning how long-term this conflict really is. In short, mobilization wouldn't just add soldiers to Russia's side. It could also add resolve to the other side. Sometimes a show of strength ends up strengthening your opponent instead. So if a dramatic announcement carries that much risk, what's Russia more likely to do instead? Let's wrap this up with the forecast. Forecast and key indicators to watch. So, will Putin order another mobilization? Based on everything we've covered, a loud, dramatic, nationwide announcement like the one in 2022 seems unlikely. The political cost was simply too high. What's far more probable is something quieter, a slow, rolling mobilization, using the new digital systems we talked about earlier, region by region, without headlines or panic. If this is happening, there are warning signs to watch for. Keep an eye on sudden spikes in regional sign-on bonuses, sharp increases in electronic draft notices, unexpected new border restrictions, or a noticeable drop in monthly volunteer numbers. Each of those could quietly signal that pressure is building behind the scenes. So here's the real question for you. Does a silent, gradual mobilization scare you more than a loud, dramatic one? Or is Russia simply buying time, hoping the war ends before it ever has to make that choice? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this story is far from finished.